After announcing new coronavirus measures, the Prime Minister addressed the nation last night ahead of what he called difficult months to come.
The struggle against Covid is the single biggest crisis the world has faced in my lifetime. The tragic reality of having Covid is that your mild cough can be someone else's death knell. And as for the suggestion that we should simply lock up the elderly and the vulnerable, with all the suffering that would entail, I must tell you that this is just not realistic. If we follow these simple rules together, we will get through this winter together.
Well, there's 32 scientists who disagree with the Prime Minister's new measures, and they've written an open letter to the government calling for a more targeted approach that protects the most vulnerable in our society.
Well, we're joined now by two authors of that letter, Professor Sunetra Gupta and Professor Karol Sikora. Welcome to both of you.
Good morning.
Professor Gupta, let's start with you first. What do the 32 scientists actually want? Because you have said we don't care if people get infected.
Well, that's right. So we have to recognise that we actually all have a common goal, which is to protect the vulnerable people. We want to stop deaths from happening. And we know that that deaths only happen in a certain group of people whom we're calling vulnerable. So the real question is, what is the most efficient way to achieve this without causing harm to the rest of the population? By harm, the harm is not simply the inconvenience of wearing a face mask. That's not what we mean by harm. The harm is the palpable problems that are faced, that we can see, the problems encountered by children in receiving education, young people in going to university and receiving the training that they need to become decent citizens, the jobs that are being lost, and internationally as well, the food security issues, inequality being exacerbated. So, the harms are profound, not to mention those to other public health, aspects of public health, which I'm sure Professor
Professor Sikora, let's come to you a moment, because what you're suggesting is that actually you would shield older people and more vulnerable people. What would this mean in practice, however? Because the Prime Minister quite clearly said in his address to the nation last night that it just wouldn't work.
I think it would work. I think we all have a personal stake in this, however old we are. And what we've got to try and do is let older people and people understand their risk. When we began all this in March, we didn't really understand the virus. Now we do. We understand a lot about the virus. There are lots of apps that tell you your COVID age, tells you how you really are susceptible or not susceptible. You can work it out. The NHS have one. I've done it. Because I'm quite old, I'm not too good on my COVID age. So you get 10 points for being over 70, for example, out of a total of 20. But if you actually look at it, my interest and why I really objected to a further really complete lockdown is simply we can't afford to close the health system. If we close the health system, more people will die. And the three diseases that are really, you can't put on the shelf to wait for it to be over, are cancer, heart disease and stroke. Some of the others as well, mental health, you can't put on the shelf. And, you can with arthritis and hip replacements, but that causes a lot of suffering. Yes. So it's balancing out that suffering, and we've got to get the balance right. And
right, so let's talk about that balance and the things that were the new measures that were brought in, working from home when you can, hospitality, leisure businesses closed between 10 and 5, pubs, bars and restaurants provide table service only, higher fines, limiting the size of weddings. So all of that, we went through that yesterday, and we were live on air as it was all being unrolled. And then right at the very end, it was like, oh, and by the way, this is for 6 months. Now, is this a sort of scare tactics that do this, behave, be good, and then eventually, hopefully before Christmas, we can relax it. But if you're not, then you've got this for 6 months.
I think it is scare tactics. We've heard it before. I mean, the whole way, the strategy, the psychological release strategy of information. So the day before yesterday, we got the medical officer and the scientific officer giving us really bad news, showing us the worst possible prediction. And Sunetra can agree or disagree. I think she'll agree with me that 50,000 a day new cases by the 13th of October is very unlikely. It is the worst case scenario. And then after that, you claw back a bit. The actual announcement by Boris wasn't as bad as we were all expecting. We thought it'd be much worse. And 6 months, that seems an awful long time. But you can review it every month. You can review it every week. On every Friday, you can say, let's sit down and look at the data. And the key data at the moment are the number of people going into hospital. And we just don't know what's happening there. In Spain, it seemed to have passed the peak quite quickly. If it does the same here, we can all relax a lot more. That's the key data set we need to look at.
Professor Gupta, I mean, it's clear that you don't believe that these new guidelines are going to make any difference. If they don't make a difference and the government don't see things changing, where does that leave us? Will there be stricter rules coming in? Will we have to lock down further? What would make a difference?
Well, it depends on what you mean by won't make any difference. It is possible. I just don't think we can tell. It's not something you can actually predict using mathematical models what sorts of effects these particular measures might have. But the problem is that where we're coming from is a completely different conceptual framework. We don't think that bringing cases down is a sensible, a rational goal for a welfare state.
So are you, Professor Gupta, are you talking about herd immunity here? Are you talking about letting younger people catch it because they should?
Yeah. We think that the most efficient way to achieve this state where the vulnerable will be at low risk is by ensuring that most of the population is immune, or a large fraction, whatever fraction is necessary, is immune or resistant to this virus. And that's how we live with a variety of other illnesses that spread in the same way and cause as much damage, or can cause death in vulnerable. So we want to get there, and we think the best way to get there without causing harm to, particularly to the young and the deprived, is to have this age stratified strategy whereby we protect the vulnerable. We don't lock them away. That's not at all what we meant. In fact, if anything, I think these strategies might lead eventually to a broader kind of change of attitude in society, to not lock the old people away. There are studies that show that old people, when they're more exposed to their grandchildren on a regular basis, are actually more likely to survive the effects of an assault from a new virus.
Professor Sikora, sorry to jump in there, but we're running a little bit out of time. Professor Sikora, these 32 scientists have a very specific view on how we should be doing this, which is contrary to what the government have been looking at, the path that they've taken. They're looking, we heard, as you were talking about, Sir Patrick Vallance and Professor Chris Whitty, 50,000 deaths a day on October the 15th, was sort of worst case scenario, scare the living daylights out of all of us. They're not looking at your path. Their path is behave or we lock you down even further. And so if what they're doing now, and you said it won't make much of a difference, if it doesn't make a difference, we will get locked down again, won't we?
Well, it depends totally on what actually happens to people's health. So looking at the data on hospitalizations is the key. If that doesn't go up significantly, I mean, it's going up, but not that much at the moment. And if it peaks at about 300, 400 patients a day going into hospital and then falls, that's really good news. And none of us know what's going to happen. And that's the whole problem. No one has Sunetra's an epidemiologist. She looks at figures and has great experience in looking at mathematical modeling and information. But the reality in the clinical world is we don't know what's going to happen, and Boris doesn't know what's going to happen. So I think we can get out of this somehow. What we've got to do is do the trick of keeping the health service going for everything else as much as possible, and at the same time making sure we can do the best we can for those that have COVID. I think the whole question of the vulnerable, the elderly, I think we just have to use common sense to protect them, tell them not to go into crowds. That's the most important message for them.
All right.
Thank you
Thank you
very
both
much
for joining us.